Okay, honeydew project number 412. Just got this mirror project. I need to put a frame around it, and that's something I've done quite a bit of, and I've got a pretty simple, easy method to do it. First thing to do is to measure the outside, the actual size of the mirror. We have 16 by 68, and the next step is deciding on the size of the trim. You know, if it was up to me, I'd have those little cheesy clips and just slap this thing on the wall, but obviously there's some decorating involved in this. So I was told she wanted 3.5 inches of natural wood with just a satin finish on it. So we've got 3.5 width all the way around, so we need to calculate that. So again, the mirror, this specific mirror is 16 by 68, 3.5 inches of trim. So on both sides of the mirror, or top and bottom, any given side, it'll add 7 inches to it. So we need 2 pieces at 16 plus 7 is 23, and 2 pieces at 68 plus 7 is 75. So we need 2 at 75 and 2 at 23. Okay, so now we've got, this is only about 9/16 thick is how thick I'm going to make this frame. So we're going to notch out, basically dado it for the mirror to sit in all the way around. So we want to notch all the boards the same way, run it through the table saw like this, and then lay it down and run it through like that, and that'll get us that dado out of it. So we need to verify the thickness of our mirror over here, and then start cutting that dado in. Looks like that's 1/4 inch glass, so we're not going to have too much left out of this. You know, you can use 3/4 and you know, lots of different sizes. I just wanted to keep this very thin up against the wall. So you set the height of the blade at the distance in you want your dado to go, or how much mirror you want showing. This one being only a 16-inch wide mirror, I didn't want to take up too much of a mirror. So I have it set at about 5/8 depth, and that'll be how far the trim will sit over the mirror at about 5/8. Okay, so we've got that first dado cut in there. Next is we want to adjust the height so that it just takes out that dado, but not up into the wood any more than that. So we can just set a piece up against it and crank it down until it's the high part of the blade is below that cut. And then we want to set the fence in so it just cuts out that piece. And we've got our first dado cut in there. Now you can cut these miters obviously by the measurement here, but I like to actually put the trim on the workpiece, whether it's a picture frame or a mirror or whatever, and actually mark it, because it gets pretty confusing, especially with the dado when you go to cut this, because you can't see as well, and it's hard to know the depth and subtraction for that depth. So what I actually do is I'll put blocks underneath it, and that allows me to put the trim all the way around it and actually mark where it's going to go instead of instead of trusting my measurements. So with those blocks underneath, then I can slide the trim in and actually get my measurements. So I usually start though by cutting with the short piece because it's easiest to work with. I'll cut a 45 on this side and then come back and hold it in there and measure the other side. So I've got that 45 cut on this side, and I want to leave about 1/8 of an inch on each side, and then I'll cut a 45 on this side. So I go out 1/8, and then I actually mark kind of the angle that I want, even though we know it's a 45, but sometimes it's confusing when you're flipping the board around on the chop saw which way that cut's going to go. So I usually just mark it as an angle like that, and that way I don't get confused. So once you get two of the sides cut here, or one of each side I guess, now you don't have to hold the trim up here to get the measurements. You can just take what you call a long point measurement. So it's easy to be able to measure the long point and chop it on your table saw. We're at 21.5 inches. The short point, the inside, is always difficult to measure. You have to almost burn 1 inch because you can't really put the tip of the tape measure on that. And this has got to be pretty close. I mean, it's got to be within 1/8 of an inch, and you sure don't want to be short. So I always measure long point. It's easy to grab onto the long point. It's easy to read the long point, and also cutting, when you go to cut it, you cut that 45 and pull your tape to 21.5 and mark it, and it's easy to see that outside edge as you're cutting on long point measurements. So I would suggest long point measurements over short point on a 45. Okay, and then one final test fit, just to make sure everything's going to be okay before we tack it together. And this is looking good. It's got our 1/8 gap on the sides and on the top and the bottom. Yeah, it looks good. Let's put the frame together. So got the frame together and glued up really well. I'm going to cheat and use a little pinner, but I'd really suggest, if you're doing stuff like this often, is to get one of these little pinners. You can get a little compressor and a pinner for a package deal for under a couple $100, but they just shoot these tiny little pins without a head on them. And what's really nice is it doesn't take much of a compressor to shoot it. They don't leave a big hole, so you don't have a lot of putty work to do, and they're inexpensive and pretty safe, easy to work with. You just want to keep your fingers out of a distance between, a couple inches out. But they really work well for stuff like this. They'll shoot into even this hard maple really well, and that'll just help that glue to hold for a while. And that's all we've got in here. The pins will help the glue. And then I just I'll set the mirror in it, get that glue out of the way. But rather than put a bunch of clamps around it and stuff and trying to square it up, we'll just leave this mirror in it, and that'll keep it square and where it's supposed to be. We'll let that dry. So there's a lot of hardware at your local hardware store to actually fasten the mirror to the frame, and probably a lot simpler. But I just cutting up some fairly thin gauge metal, and I'm just going to screw them on the corners to support the corner of the mirror on all 4 corners. And then I'm going to cut some little strips here for putting in the middle. We can put a screw in like that and then hinge it up to help support the mirror as well. Well, I sanded it down real well and then hit it with 2 coats of polyurethane. I just put a satin finish on it. That's what we were looking for. Obviously you could prime and paint it or do whatever else. This was some really nice wood, and I wanted the grain of the wood to come out, so we just put a satin finish on it. But you could certainly use particle board, like MDF kind of board, and paint it, and it's also a lot easier and more forgiving to work with. So we'll put these corners on, and then we want about an inch or so of meat back in the frame, and that's where we'll put a couple of screws on each side. Want to stay away from that miter a bit, but the good thing about these little pieces of sheet metal is it will help our corners hold together. So we want to pre-drill these, and I've already done one, and I countersunk. I'm going to use these little tiny screws since our trim's only half inch wide. We have to be careful not to push through that, so these won't. But I don't want any extra height in the back. We've already got, you know, a little over a 1/16 in this metal. So by countersinking those, they'll sit in there nice and flush, and then it'll keep the profile a little bit lower. So what I'm using is it's a wood countersink bit. This is a multi, so you can switch it around and use the Phillips head or whichever head you put on the other side. But with this light gauge, this is actually aluminum. It does really well as far as countersinking this stuff. So put a piece of scrap wood on top here so we're not damaging up our frame. And we do the same to our little side brackets. Okay, so we'll drill in with a very small drill bit, because these are very small screws. And what I usually do is I'll do one corner and fasten it, and then that stabilizes the whole thing, and then I can drill the other 3 and not worrying about it moving around too much. Well, that's it, it's all done. Now I didn't put a hanger on this because this is actually going to sit on the ground, but you could easily put a screw in each side, or loosen a couple of these screws and put some baling wire between them. This is a super heavy mirror, so it would have to be beefed up quite a bit, but we're going to go set her in the house and enjoy having a frame around it.